In tonight's news edition, the Prime Minister checks on services during a field tour in the Zarqa Governorate. The foreign ministers of Jordan and Bahrain call for international donors to double aid for Jordan to cope with the influx of Syrian refugees. And South Korea, Japan and the United States are on high alert for a North Korean missile test launch. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news, and here are the details. We begin with our local news. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour met tribal elders and citizens during a tour of the Zarqa Governorate to check firsthand about public services in underdeveloped areas. Mansour, accompanied by a number of ministers, told local leaders that His Majesty the King is aware of the challenges facing Zarqa and had directed authorities to find solutions, particularly to environmental problems and the poor infrastructure. Mansour first stopped at the Hattid refugee camp and proceeded to the Zarqa River Basin, the town of Al-Sayfa, Zarqa City and the districts of Hashmiya and Adlil. He said his government will pursue field work and reach out to all citizens to learn firsthand about their needs and try to address their problems. The Prime Minister pledged his government will do all it can to achieve social justice and ensure that the development gains will fairly reach to all areas. In Hattid refugee camp, he said the government is keen to improve services and living conditions for its population. He said authorities would ask the United Nations Refugee Agency UNRWA not to cut health and education services to Palestinian refugees. At the Zarqa Basin, Mansour said a committee has been named to secure financing to rebuild the river to ensure the area will be clean and pollution-free. He also called for addressing the problem of water cuts in Al-Sayfa to ensure regular supply of water in the phosphate mines town. In Zarqa, he promised to build a military museum and an Islamic cemetery and also address other grievances. Bahrain's Foreign Minister Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed Al Khalifa said his country is aware of the huge burdens Jordan bears for taking in a growing number of Syrian refugees. In an address to the World Affairs Council here in Amman, he said Jordan is struggling to cope with the humanitarian situation and meets its obligations towards the Syrian refugees in the current circumstances. Sheikh Khalid said Bahrain maintains strong ties with Jordan, which also has close relations with all the other members of the Six-Nation Gulf Cooperation Council. The Bahraini minister later toured the Zaati refugee camp, where Bahrain has built an education facility. Farah Ajlouni has more.
During the Zaatari refugee camp in northern Jordan, a Bahraini delegation led by Foreign Minister Sheikh Khalid Al Khalifa took a first-hand look at the plight of Syrian refugees and the kind of services offered to them. Zaatari, the largest Syrian refugee camp in the kingdom, now holds over 150,000 people. Yesterday, another refugee camp opened east of Zarqa, which will initially accommodate 30,000 refugees. Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh, who accompanied the Bahraini officials, told reporters Jordan is doing its utmost to secure a decent life for the refugees. But he cautioned the kingdom cannot continue in this endeavor without donor nations doubling their aid. He appealed to donors and international organizations to deliver on pledges toward Jordan, home to about 500,000 refugees, the biggest host of Syrian refugees among regional countries. Joudeh and his Bahraini counterpart called on donors and friendly nations to double their relief humanitarian aid and help Jordan cope with the biggest migration in modern history. The Bahraini minister said it's time the world community becomes aware of the magnitude of the burdens posed by the refugees' influx. He commended the Jordanian government, the Hashemite Charity Organization, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for their continued relief efforts. During a tour of a Bahraini-funded scientific center which provides education for refugee students in Zaatari, Sheikh Khalid listened to teachers and students who aired their grievances. The refugee population in the kingdom is growing at an alarming pace. The Jordanian armed forces said more than 1,700 refugees crossed the border in the past 24 hours. That brings to about 10,000 the number of Syrians who made it to the kingdom since the beginning of this week. The military command said most of the arrivals were women, children and old people, as well as 9 injured people. It said border guards helped the refugees and provided them with immediate assistance before evacuating them to refugee camps. The kingdom has sounded the alarm that the exodus has overstretched resources and warned of an impending catastrophe unless additional foreign aid is forthcoming. Farah Ajlouni for the news at 10.
Hundreds of Hashemite University students rallied to denounce a recent spike in campus violence in the kingdom's universities. The students staged a silent theater at the Faculty of Engineering, urging contemplation of the perilous consequences of campus violence. The displays by national, family and child education students were to highlight the reasons for violence, often driven by incidents of female harassment or bigotry. Students held placards calling for renouncing on-campus violence and stressing diligence and hard work while promoting the spirit of harmony and brotherhood. They also distributed pictures of Osama Dheysat, a civil engineering student at Mu'ta University who died in recent riots that forced the closure of the university for several days. Female students during the rally held the slogan, "Stop the Violence," saying it's high time for change and work to end the tampering with our academic landmarks. Over to Syria. At least 45 Syrians were killed after troops stormed a town in the southern province of Daraa. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said dozens of civilians, including children, were killed in shelling and summary executions after forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad entered the town of As-Sanamin. Khalid Babni has the latest.
The conflict in Syria continues to take lives. The opposition accused government forces of carrying out a massacre in the southern town of As-Sanamin near Daraa. Rows of corpses were laid out in a building, their faces covered in blood and their bodies wrapped in blankets, with names scribbled on sheets of paper placed on top of them. Some of the dead appeared to be young children. Dozens of houses had been destroyed in the shelling or by fire. The British-based monitoring group Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported dozens of civilians, including children, have been killed yesterday in shelling and summary executions after government forces entered Sanamin. In northern Syria, the battle for Aleppo continued between rebels and army troops. In this video, armed men said to be rebels aim a hail of machine gun fire at forces outside the main gate of an army base as insurgents attempt to free prisoners held by the regime. Thick black smoke rose from a building said to be a factory bombed by government forces. A report released by Human Rights Watch accuses the Syrian Air Force of carrying out indiscriminate and at times deliberate airstrikes against civilians. Such attacks are in direct violation of international humanitarian law, and those involved in their execution are responsible for war crimes.
We believe that more than 4,000 civilians have been killed as a result of aerial attacks. It is an enormous number, and most of the civilians died in areas where there is no fighting going on, where there is no military activity. These are civilians that were either deliberately targeted or killed as a result of unlawful, indiscriminate attacks, which we believe were committed willfully and thus constitute war crimes.
The report said Human Rights Watch has documented 10 targeted government attacks on bread lines and bakeries in the country. The Dar al-Shifa hospital in Aleppo has also been the target of airstrikes. According to the rights watchdog, initial aerial attacks documented were rocket attacks.
The first aerial attacks that we documented were rocket attacks. But very soon thereafter, we saw the government using bigger and bigger bombs. The unguided, so-called dumb bombs that are very difficult to use in any precise way.
Solvang said that Human Rights Watch has asked the UN Security Council to put pressure on the Syrian government to bring an end to human rights violations in Syria. Hala Dababne for the news at 10.
Foreign ministers from the G8 group of rich countries failed to patch up deep divisions over Syria or come up with a concrete plan on North Korea. Leaders of the Syrian National Coalition were present on the sidelines of the G8 meeting and were expected to hold talks with ministers willing to meet them. British Foreign Secretary William Hague, speaking after talks with his counterparts, admitted the world had done too little to try to resolve Syria's two-year-old conflict.
The world has failed so far in its responsibilities and continues to do so. The United Nations Security Council, as I've said in Parliament the last time we discussed this, has not fulfilled its responsibilities on Syria because it is divided. That division continues. Have we solved that division at this meeting? No, we didn't expect to do so.
Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad offered his resignation to President Mahmoud Abbas following a rift between the two men over a government policy. Abbas was due to return to the West Bank from Jordan today. It is not immediately clear if he will accept the resignation of Fayyad, who's been a prime minister since 2007. The Palestinian Authority is reeling from its worst financial crisis due to Israeli restrictions and failure of donors to make good on aid pledges. South Korea, Japan and the United States were on high alert for a North Korean missile test launch. But the North was celebrating the rule of the Kim dynasty and appeared to tone down rhetoric of impending war. Zain Abu Sufa has more on the tension.
Hundreds of North Koreans danced in Pyongyang, celebrating the first anniversary of their leader Kim Jong-un's official ascent to power. Despite recent threats to attack U.S. bases and the South, North Korea started to welcome a stream of visitors for Monday's celebration, marking the birthday of its founder, Kim Il-sung. While the party was on, South Korea, Japan, and the United States remained on high alert for any North Korean attack. Despite the rhetoric from Pyongyang, it does not appear to have placed its 1.2 million strong armed forces on high alert. But the North threatened South Korea again today, saying it is ready to fire. North Korea is due to observe several anniversaries in the coming few days that could be pretexts for displays of military strength. Japan's Kyodo News reported a North Korean mobile missile launcher been put into a firing position with rockets facing skyward. PAC-3 missile defense systems were on standby inside Japan's Ministry of Defense to face possible missile strikes. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said his country is working with allies with a sense of urgency. South Korea said there was no sign of foreign diplomats leaving South or North Korea despite escalating tensions of the peninsula and warnings by Pyongyang for foreigners to leave. South Korea's unification minister urged North Korea to return to negotiations.
The government expresses regret that North Korea continues to threaten to provoke us and the international community. We strongly urge North Korea not to continue creating a crisis on the peninsula.
South Korea said that after weeks of threats of war, it was high probable that the North would test launch of medium-range missile as a show of strength. Its defense ministry said missiles could be shot down if there was a risk of harm to the South Korean people. The Chinese Foreign Ministry called on all parties concerned to take actions to turn around the situation on the Korean peninsula. On a first visit to South Korea as head of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen paid vows to South Korea's foreign minister to enhance cooperation with South Korea over North Korea's threats. Zain Abu Sufa, News at 10.
In China, another person died from a new strain of bird flu. That brings to 10 the number of deaths from the H7N9 virus. A UN body said it was concerned that the virus could spread across borders in poultry. The latest victim was in commercial hub of Shanghai, where several of the 38 cases have been found. The avian flu has triggered worries about food safety. We get more in this report.
The discovery of bird flu in Shanghai has left Chinese consumers worried about food safety. Many have been turning away from poultry after an outbreak of the strain of bird flu known as H7N9. At least 9 people have now died and thousands of live chickens have been culled. At this Shanghai market, business has slowed. Restrictions to stop the virus spreading apply to live chickens, but other traders are taking a hit as well. Egg seller Men Wenfang says purchases at her stall have dropped. And sales at this frozen chicken stand have slumped by around 90%. Consumers say they're not prepared to take the risk.
The government informed us, so we know about it. They never told us to stop eating it, but we try and avoid it as much as possible.
It's not just market sales that have been hit by bird flu fears. A sign at this KFC tells consumers that international health experts say cooked chicken is safe. The restaurant's parent company says the latest outbreak could have a significant impact on sales.
In our sports outlook, we begin with some NBA action. Josh Smith led the Atlanta Hawks to a 124-101 victory over the Philadelphia 76ers in Philadelphia. The forward scored 28 points and pulled down 12 rebounds for the Hawks. Thaddeus Young led Philadelphia with 28 points, while Nick Young had 19 off the bench as the 76ers lost their 3rd straight game.
He and John Jenkins both outstanding. Philadelphia will not shoot again, or yes, they will. Mr. Holiday will put it up, and that will be the ball game.
And in the United Kingdom, the British Premier League has approved the introduction of the British Hawkeye system to put an end to contentious goal line decisions. The system, which involves 7 cameras behind each goal, is expected to take up to 6 weeks to complete at clubs competing in the Premier League next season. The system will notify the referee if the ball has crossed the line within 1 second.
Hawkeye is a high-speed video camera system that can be installed around the goal.
Now a look at the weather. Relatively cold tonight with northwesterly moderate winds. A slight rise in temperatures is expected tomorrow, so it will be nice in hilly areas and moderate elsewhere. There will be a chance for scattered showers in the evening hours, especially in the eastern regions. Winds will be northwesterly moderate, turning northwesterly moderate to brisk, stirring dust in the Badia. Aqaba should expect some nice weather tonight and relatively hot day tomorrow with northerly moderate to brisk winds and seas slightly choppy. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now, to close, here's a reminder of our top stories. The Prime Minister checks on services during a field tour in the Zarqa Governorate. The foreign ministers of Jordan and Bahrain call for international donors to double aid for Jordan to cope with the influx of Syrian refugees. And South Korea, Japan and the United States are on high alert for a North Korean missile test launch. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I am Raad Laptouche. Thanks for watching and have a good night.